Hi guys, I hope you've accessed this video okay. The final lesson of this half term is going to be a small revision lesson, and then you'll notice at the end of this video the activity I'm asking you to do is slightly different to the one you would do normally. But as always, I'd like to watch this video, and then at the end there will be two different tasks for you to complete. They are, however, slightly different to the tasks that we are normally doing in the review questions. So essentially, I want to do a little bit of revision here because we've actually studied quite a large number of topics this half term. We've been looking at this overarching term ecosystem. If you look at this flow diagram here, you can clearly see that we've actually done quite a lot of stuff. We've looked at what ecosystems are and some elements of them. We've then looked at something called a biome. We've then spent some time looking at the climate of different biomes before we go into adaptation and biodiversity. We've then looked at what the threats to ecosystems are, and have finished off by looking specifically at the marine ecosystem and the problem of plastic pollution. So we should feel really proud of ourselves in the sense we've covered an awful lot of content, and I'm hoping that a lot of this lesson today will just ring the bells for you. My advice would be to watch this before you complete the end quiz, as it would give you that kind of memory read jog to help you out with that. So without further ado, what we're going to do is we're going to go through each of these topics very briefly to kind of allow you to recap them, have another little think about them, and then, like I said, there'll be some activities at the end. So when we were starting this topic, we addressed this definition of something called an ecosystem. And we decided that an ecosystem was a community of living organisms interacting with the non-living parts of an environment. An ecosystem can vary in size from a small hedge right the way to being the larger part of a rainforest. And within that definition, there are two key words there about the living and non-living parts of the ecosystem. And that leads to these two factors here. So within an ecosystem, we have the abiotic, which are the non-living factors, and the biotic factors. So for the abiotic factors, they are not alive, and they are things like the geology, the rocks, the water, the soil, the air. The biotic factors are things like animals and plants. So if you have a look at that picture on the right hand side, you should be able to see some abiotic and biotic factors. Now the interaction between all those different things, between the plants, the water, the soil, the atmosphere, all those different interactions is what an ecosystem is, essentially. And we also have this thing called a food chain, which basically shows the flow of energy across an ecosystem. So again, this is that interaction, a biotic interaction from there as well. What we then turned to look at was these things called biomes. And if you want to pause this video for 5 or 10 seconds and just have a little look at this map again and look at the names of the different biomes along the bottom. Okay, so we were looking at mainly biomes such as the tropical rainforest, the temperate forest. It's called the it's called the tundra in this kind of orangey colour here as well. We've been looking at quite a lot in addition to that. And remember, a biome is an area of land which has a similar climate, similar soils, and similar plant and animal life. And if you recall, it's all to do with this word latitude. So latitude are those imaginary lines that circle our Earth, the equator being the most famous one. And as you go north or south from the equator, your latitude changes the characteristics of your place. And therefore, it should be of no surprise that the typical biome follows that general pattern. So generally, along the equator, we've mostly got rainforest, with the exception of a few mountain biomes. And again, that's because if it's on the same line of latitude, it will have a very similar climate. If it has a very similar climate, it will therefore have very similar plants and animals living there, very similar levels of biodiversity as well. Another example being that if we follow the tundra biome at the top here, we can see that they all tend to occur along very similar lines of latitude. And that's really, really important when it comes to addressing the different climates. Now, when we were looking at the climate of a biome, I told you that in geography, the way we measure climate, the way we measure climate in biomes is by using something called a climate graph. And we've done climate graphs. This will be the third or fourth time you've looked at them this year. And I'm hoping now that you will feel very confident in what they are and how to use them as well. And if you remember, they show precipitation and they show temperature. The temperature is shown by this red line graph here. The precipitation is shown by this blue bar chart along the bottom. And essentially, we can then see that we can use these graphs to really help us to understand the different climates that exist across different biomes. And so we can see that again here, where if we were going to look at the tundra, which is that cold desert, so if you remember, the tundra is really, really cold. It goes down to about -25 in the summer months. And it's called the cold desert because it has a very, very low precipitation. Okay, very, very low indeed. In the same way as the hot desert, the difference being that the hot desert, as you can see on the climate graph, is very, very warm as opposed to very, very cold. And then finally, we have the rainforest biome here. The rainforest biome essentially meaning that we've got a lot of rain and it's hot and wet all year round. So for the rainforest, the key is that it's hot and wet all year round. So the next couple of things we looked at was this word called biodiversity. Now, biodiversity is the variety of plant and animal life in the world in a particular habitat. So it's not necessarily the number of animals that are there. So for example, if I've got a field with 1,000 zebras in it, the biodiversity is going to be quite low. If I've got a field with zebras, lions, giraffes, tigers, antelopes, warthogs, the biodiversity is higher. It's the variety of the different species that makes it really, really important. And if you recall, this links back with the biomes because the idea would be that our biodiversity would be higher in the rainforest than it would in the hot desert or the tundra. And that's because with it being warm and wet, they're the best conditions for life, and so it can support a variety of species. In the tundra and the desert, the biodiversity tends to be very, very low. But for the animals living in those harsh environments, they have to have adapted. Okay, so adaptation is how an animal has changed its appearance to live in a specific area. Now, the most common example we looked at was the camel. Okay, so the camel had lots of different adaptations, changes in its body to fit the location. And if you're in my live lesson, you are welcome to type in the adaptation song into YouTube and give that another watch because it is unbelievably cringe, but it's really a good way of remembering the camel. So they have things like a fat-filled hump, they have wide feet to stop them burning their feet, they have those long eyelashes as well to keep the sand out of their eyes because it's very, very sandy, a lot of sandstorms in the desert. And that has all enabled the camel to survive in such a harsh environment for a longer period of time. And then we kind of moved on to this idea that humans were also impacting ecosystems. So, as humans, we are having a huge impact on the world, and in particular, we are causing some pretty major problems for the world's ecosystems. And there are three things we looked at. The first image down here is about factories and pollution. And this is the idea that what humans are doing is we are polluting the water, we're polluting the air by all the work we're doing in factories. So we're releasing heavy metals and toxins into the water. We're releasing pesticides and harmful chemicals from farming to local rivers and local lakes. And all that is obviously having an adverse impact on that ecosystem or a negative impact on the ecosystem. The second factor was deforestation, hence the two trees being chopped down. So deforestation is the process of clearing forest. And remember that humans are clearing huge amounts of the tropical rainforest for things like wood, for things like mining, for energy as well. And then the final thing, which the guy with the bin on the right hand side, is we were looking at how humans were harming the environment through waste disposal. And we're going to look at that a little bit more on the next couple of slides. But the argument is that human beings have a huge amount of waste. When you guys are at home today or on another day, we listen to this video, you will have already put stuff in the bin. I imagine you might have had a packet of crisps. You might have had, I don't know, you might have broken something, you might have ripped some paper, you might have put that in the bin. And all that waste has to go somewhere. And the problem is we are recycling, but we are obviously not recycling to the level that enables us to get rid of everything. And a lot of that waste is starting to find its way into the natural environment and it's having an impact on the animals that live there. And one of the main examples we looked at was plastic in the ocean. And to finish off then, guys, at the end of this unit, we decided to look more closely at the marine ecosystem. Now, the key point here is that vegetation is different between the ocean and the land ecosystem. So in the ocean, the vegetation is very, very small. In particular, it's those microscopic plankton. Whereas on a land ecosystem, a terrestrial ecosystem, it's mainly those large plants, like the large trees that we are used to seeing. And that leads to a big difference because it means that a lot of the food chains in the ocean rely on that plankton in huge quantities. Okay, and the second big difference was light. Again, if we're on land, we have pretty much good access to light most of the year in most of the different biomes. Whereas in the marine ecosystem, after the first 100 meters of ocean, it's very, very dark, the midnight zone, and therefore we get very distributed biodiversity. Where in the ocean, the most biodiversity is in that top 100 meters because there's light there, and that enables the vegetation growth. It's very, very different on the two of them. And then finally, we then looked at this idea of plastic. And so we know that humans are polluting the ocean. We know that plastic is becoming an increasingly large problem. And there are three reasons why. The main reason, this is links the one and the bottle as well, is these things called single-use plastics. Now, you guys all use single-use plastics. It's plastic that you use once and throw away. So like a water bottle that you buy, like a drink from the canteen. When you buy a carton of milkshake and you throw it in the bin, that has plastic in it. It's a single-use plastic. There are loads and loads of examples. Some carrier bags in shops, not the bags for life. They tend to be multiple use. But a lot of you can always think of a plastic that you use once to throw it away. And as we throw that away, it started to spill out into the ocean. And you would say, well, what about recycling? But the problem is that we can only recycle currently about 9 or 10% of the world's plastic. So about 90% is still going into landfill, it's still being dumped elsewhere, and that is starting to end up in the ocean as well. Because the ocean is very, very big, very, very vast, and it enables people to get rid of their waste, or it ends up in the ocean as well, which is a big, big problem for that. So to finish off then, guys, I told you your task was slightly different today. Firstly, I would like you to complete the multiple choice quiz that has been set on Satchel 1. It's only 9 or 10 questions. It will take you no more than 10 minutes to do that, but I would like you to have a go at that quiz. You only get one attempt, so I would really like you to make sure that you are taking your time with those questions. So really read through each of the options and decide which one is right. Don't just guess it, or that kind of loses its value as such. And then secondly, because I only take you 10 minutes, I also want you to use the PowerPoint or use this video to make some revision notes as well. So on a rough piece of paper, on a Word document, this can be a mind map, it can be a poster, or it can be flashcards. And essentially, you can make it how you want. I only want it to include maybe about 10-15 pieces of information maximum, and then upload that as well, because that will help you when we come back into school. You might be able to use those notes again. As always, any questions, please follow the Zoom link.